doing webinars with Orange Tree. Just always so organized and well put together. I love the Orange Tree brand, and it's a privilege for us at the Current Consulting Group to be associated with Orange Tree. And the fact that they do these webinars. Some of you who work with Orange Tree, maybe Orange Tree is a provider of your background screening, your drug testing, etc. But you may not realize how spoiled you've become, because most companies in our industry don't do this type of outreach. They don't provide these types of webinars, for example. And so this is somewhat unique, but valuable. And so my hat's off to Orange Tree for doing this on a regular basis and for our opportunity to be a part of it. Let me go straight to our agenda, but you'll have access to the recording. You'll be able to see these slides. Jeff, if you want to share these slides as well, no problem doing that. You can have access to the slides to share them with your audience. I'm going to provide some upfront information to sort of set the table, and then we're going to talk about 3 different reasons why I think it's important to continue testing for marijuana, and we'll sort of lead up to that. Then we'll talk about how to measure your return on investment from drug testing and testing for marijuana specifically. Excuse me. But let's set the table first. Quest Diagnostics is a very popular brand laboratory in our industry. They put out a report every year. They're very generous in sharing their statistics from their drug testing from year to year. And this is from what they call the drug testing index. Positivity rates for marijuana in the general workforce, so not counting DOT tests, based on more than 6 million non-DOT urine drug tests, continued an upward climb in 2021, increasing 8.3%. That's the highest positivity rate ever reported by Quest Diagnostics. Over a 5-year period, positivity for marijuana, again, in the non-DOT workplace, increased 50% between 2017 and 2021. Now, look at that next one. Positivity particularly surged, meaning positive drug test results, particularly surged in states with legal recreational laws. So as you know, a lot of states have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes, and about 19 states have legalized marijuana for recreational or so-called adult use of marijuana. In those states, positive drug test results increased 118% over between 2012 and in 2020. The overall positivity rate in the combined U.S. workforce, so this is Quest putting together their DOT and non-DOT results based on nearly 9 million urine drug tests collected between January and December of 2021. So this is the latest data that's available from Quest, was up in 2021 to 4.6% compared to 4.4%, and up 31.4% from an all-time low of 3.5% back in 2010. Now, if you look at, and I, like many of you, I'm sure you had to take statistics courses in college. If you look at an increase of 4.6 or from 4.4% to 4.6%, it on the surface appears to be just a slight increase. But when you're talking in the millions, that's a significant increase. It's what statisticians would call a statistically significant increase. And so we're seeing a lot more people using marijuana and a lot more people testing positive in the workplace for marijuana. We know that marijuana use is up, and there's some statistics on the right. I'm not going to go through all of that, but we know marijuana use is up. I do have a couple stats on that coming up. But the perceived risk of harm, that middle category there, is down significantly from 36.3% in 2015 to 27.4% in 2020. In other words, fewer people considered a risk to use marijuana on a weekly basis. And that's resulting or leading to that last statistic there, people trying marijuana for the first time. 2.8 million people in 2020 tried marijuana for the first time. So because of that perceived risk of harm dropping, more people are smoking marijuana, and millions of people are trying marijuana for the very first time. That's leading to an overall increase throughout the country of more people using marijuana and more employees testing positive. Now, this is the map that shows the status or the legal status of marijuana throughout the country. The orange states are states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana. The blue states are the medicinal marijuana states, although all of the orange states also have medicinal marijuana laws as well. The white states would appear to be the states that have not legalized marijuana, but in many of those states, they've voted to, or politicians have created laws that decriminalize the possession of certain small amounts of marijuana. So if we were to include them, the map would be even more colorful, because a lot of states have not legalized it like they have, say, in, all along the West Coast there, Washington, Oregon, California, but they decriminalized the drug. And the sort of surge in states that have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, particularly, beginning with Colorado, Washington, Oregon, in the early, decade of the 2010s, call it, that coincides with a steady year-to-year increase in marijuana use. And so this is a report from the federal government, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, that shows an increase from 2019 of 17.5% of people admitting in that report that they were regular users of marijuana to 17.9%. Again, it looks like a small increase, but when you're talking about tens of millions of people, it's a statistically significant increase. We saw a drop from 2019 to 2020 in psychotherapeutic drug use, but we're thinking that that's probably going to go up in this year's report from the federal government, because we're seeing a fairly significant increase in the use of other drugs besides marijuana, particularly synthetic opioids and amphetamines for that matter. So we're expecting to see some of these other drug categories increasing while marijuana continues to increase as well. And it has a direct impact on the workplace and what employers' perception is in terms of whether or not they can even address the marijuana issue in the workplace, or if they need to sort of back away from testing for marijuana. Now, I'm going to tell you, you probably guessed it already, but I'm in favor of drug testing. I'm in favor of testing for marijuana. I think it's a poor business decision. If we just want to look at it from a bottom line perspective, I think it's a poor business decision to decide not to test for marijuana. I've got some statistics I'm going to share with you on that. But every year at the Current Consulting Group, we do a survey of employers and we do a survey of drug testing providers. In a recent survey that we did, 12.5% of employers said they were considering dropping marijuana from their drug test panel because it wasn't permitted in their state. In other words, they're under the assumption or the perception that drug testing cannot include marijuana. And look at that second bullet, 25, almost 26% of providers, drug testing providers, said that they've had clients drop marijuana because they thought it wasn't permitted, that it was illegal to test for marijuana. The truth of the matter is testing for marijuana is legal in every state, with the exception being New York. Last year, the Department of Labor in New York put out regulations that ban testing for marijuana in the workplace. However, they did leave a very narrow path open for post-accident reasonable suspicion testing for marijuana. And we could do a whole webinar on that New York Department of Labor guidance. The point is that testing for marijuana technically is legal in all 50 states, even though it's very problematic in New York. But it's legal in all the 49 other states. There may be conditions that apply to what you can do with a positive drug test result. I have a whole section coming up on that. But the legal status of testing for marijuana is without question in 49 states, and again, New York being the possible exception. Now, that wasn't the number one reason why companies consider dropping marijuana from their drug test panel. If you look at this, you'll see that the number one reason given is that they believe it makes it harder to hire people if they test for marijuana. 68% of employers said that they were considering dropping marijuana from their drug test panel because it makes it harder to hire people. There are people who will not apply for a job if they know that company conducts pre-employment testing. Or if a company has a policy that says if a job applicant tests positive for marijuana or any other drug for that matter, we're not going to hire that person. As that could make it true. That could make it harder to find people to hire because more people are smoking marijuana. We know that. More people are testing positive for marijuana. I don't believe that it makes it harder to hire good people, the right people, the kind of people who are going to stay with you and aren't going to move from job to job. There was a study out from the federal government some years ago that showed that the majority of drug users who are employed work for 2 or more employers in a year versus compared to their non-drug using coworkers or counterparts. So you're going to be hiring. It may take you a little while to find people who pass the drug test. I don't think it'll take forever, but it may make it harder to hire people, but it's going to make, but drug testing and pre-employment testing in particular makes it possible to hire the right people, people that are going to stay with you. Everybody who does hiring knows that it costs money to hire somebody. It costs money to find them. It costs money to interview them. It costs money to test them and conduct a background screen, etc. But it's worth that cost if you hire the right person and someone who's more likely to stay with you beyond that first year. Drug users tend to move around more than non-drug users. And so that perhaps is a valid reason, that 68%, but in my opinion, not a good reason to drop marijuana from your drug test panel. Here's what we know, okay? We know marijuana use is up perhaps dramatically in the US. We know that positive drug test results for marijuana are up as well significantly. And we know that there are consequences with more people using marijuana. There are a number of states, Colorado being one of them, very prominent state that is sort of ground zero for the legalization of marijuana. I just was in Denver all this week leading up to today. Marijuana-related traffic accidents and fatalities are also up. And so those are 3 good reasons to continue testing for marijuana. And I did a presentation at a conference yesterday, and of course we were talking about marijuana. That's the hot topic. And there was a lady there who is a drug testing provider, small company on the East Coast, and she said that she'd had 17 clients 2 years ago drop marijuana from their drug test panel. And she said within 2 years, 16 of those 17 companies had reinstated testing for marijuana because they saw such a dramatic drop in productivity, increases in accidents, workers' comp claims, etc. And they attributed that to the one thing that they could point to that had changed, which was they dropped marijuana from the drug test panel. So there are a lot of good reasons to continue testing for marijuana. Here's 3 of them. I'm going to share what I think are 3 very compelling reasons to continue testing for marijuana. Okay, so more people using marijuana, more predictable, negative outcomes from that. Workplace accidents, workers' comp claims, healthcare benefit usage, turnover, absenteeism, all of that leading to a reduction in productivity, people not being able to do the job that we hired them to do because they're absent more, they're tardy more, or they're just changing jobs more than those who don't use drugs. And so as we talk about the marijuana issue, we have to keep in mind what it would cost to not test for marijuana. Every employer should address marijuana in their drug testing panel policy one way or another. And in every state, all 50 states, including New York, employers still have the right to prohibit employees from using marijuana on the job, from bringing marijuana into the workplace, and from being at work impaired or under the influence of marijuana. And if nothing else, you need to state that in your drug testing policy, even if you weren't testing for marijuana, which I think is not a good decision. But even if you're not testing for marijuana, you should make it very clear that your employees may not bring marijuana to work, use marijuana while working, or be impaired or under the influence of marijuana. Now, very interesting study came out on that 3rd bullet, study from the University of Sydney that looked at 80 different studies from around the world on the issue of marijuana impairment. And I know that there are people out there, particularly the pro-marijuana folks, are telling you that there's something called the peak window of impairment, and that within that peak window of impairment, we need to be concerned. But outside of that, does an employer really have the right to know what their employees are doing on their own time? And so that peak window of impairment is that first 20 to 30 minutes, up to maybe 2 or 3 hours. The Sydney report, the University of Sydney report, concluded after looking at 80 different studies from around the world that marijuana impairment typically lasts from 3 to 10 hours and could be more depending on a number of factors. How strong is the THC potency in the marijuana being used? How often does the user smoke or ingest marijuana? How did they use the drug? Did they smoke it or did they consume edibles? And very importantly, what task are you asking them to perform? Remember instructions, balance a client's books, or operate a forklift or drive a delivery van. All of those things come into play. The effect of marijuana on cognitive and psychomotor skills varies based on all of those different factors. But here's my bottom line point. When you're talking about prohibiting a worker from being on the job impaired or under the influence, is that someone who's impaired at the 2-hour mark, let's say, and somebody who's impaired at the 7 or 8 or 9 hour mark are equally dangerous, equally, more likely to engage in some type of behavior that would be considered negative by the employer, possibly even cause an accident, property damage, harm another person, or worse. And so as an employer, you have the right, regardless of the legal status of marijuana in your state, to prohibit employees from being at work impaired or under the influence, but you need to address it that way in your drug testing policy. A marijuana-free workplace is one where you have fewer accidents. You have higher productivity, less turnover, happier workers probably, right? Because we know that about 15% of the workforce admits to being regular current users of drugs, marijuana included, marijuana of course being the #1 illicit drug of abuse. And it's important to note, of course, that under federal law, marijuana is still illegal, despite any state law. But that also means that if 15% of the workforce admits to being drug users, then 85% of the workforce is potentially not coming to work under the influence of drugs because they don't use drugs. They know who the drug users are. They don't necessarily like working side by side with them. And a marijuana-free workplace is just a better place to work. A marijuana-free workplace gives you, the employer, the opportunity to grow your business more profitably, attract and retain the kind of employees and customers that you want, because your company is not simply surviving, but you're thriving, not being held back by the substance abuse issues, and in particular, the marijuana issue today. So if you're concerned about infringing on the legal rights of your employees to do whatever they want on their own time, I would simply suggest that you stop worrying about that and continue testing for marijuana, because all you're really doing is requiring all of your employees to use marijuana somewhere else and not be at work under the influence of marijuana where their performance can be impaired. And the bottom line is you hired them to do a job, and marijuana use and impairment can impact that in a negative way. So really, you're just asking people to be as productive as they agreed to be when you hired them. And that's all you have to worry about. Comply with the state laws that apply to you, but make it clear that in our workplace, you're not allowed to bring marijuana here, you're not allowed to use marijuana here, and you're not allowed to be under the influence of marijuana here in our workplace. Be clear about those 3 points. And in the end result will be that drug testing for marijuana will continue to improve your chances of increasing revenue and improving profitability, because you're going to be hiring people more likely that are going to contribute to the success of the business. So that's #1, thriving versus simply surviving. Now, what about best employees versus just any employees? Because that's the argument we hear from a lot of employers now, is that I can't find people to hire. But if you stop testing for marijuana, are you hiring the kind of people that will help your company be successful? And so we're only as good as the quality of our workforce. When I have somebody come to my house to fix my dishwasher, for example, and they reek of marijuana, I'm not going to let them come in. And that's going to affect the bottom line of that company that I hired to repair my dishwasher. I'm simply not going to have that person come into my home if they smell like marijuana, because they were smoking marijuana clearly in their van on the way to my house. So we're only as good as our workforce, as our employees. If you look at the bottom bullet there, dropping pre-employment drug testing for marijuana will not necessarily result in more people applying for work, but it will result in more marijuana users applying for work. I guarantee that. And also getting hired, because you're not going to know they're the marijuana users, and having less safe, less productive workers on your payroll. That's what you're going to get from dropping marijuana from your drug test panel, and particularly from your pre-employment drug test panel. There was a study from the federal government some years ago. This is a little bit old, but I don't think it's dated. 40% of individuals who identified as current drug users who were employed full-time, 40% said that they were less likely to work for a company that conducted random drug testing, and 30% less likely to work for a company that conducted pre-employment testing. I don't want to hire those people. I'm not a big company, but there are 19 of us. And when I hire my 20th employee before the end of the year, I want to hire somebody that is drug-free, that I can bring to Orange Tree and do something for Orange Tree, my client, and Orange Tree is going to be happy with them because they're not a drug user. They're not impaired on the job or in the project that we're doing with Orange Tree, and Orange Tree with you, and you with your clients. If there are 30% of the job applicants out there, and it's probably a higher percentage today, that are less likely to work for a company that conducts pre-employment testing, I consider that sort of a way to know whether I should do pre-employment testing. The answer is yes, and because it's going to deter drug users from applying for a job with my company. If I drug test, and if I include marijuana in my drug test, I'm more likely to hire the best employees possible. And I talked about some of these points early on. 15% of the workforce are admitted substance abusers, including marijuana users. 85% are not. And the majority of my employees who are not drug users, or your employees, are not going to be causing accidents and having a drag on your bottom line. The end result here is that drug testing for marijuana helps you hire the best possible employees and not have to settle for just anyone to work for your company. And then compelling reason number 3 is the legal defensibility of your company and of your drug testing program versus legal bankruptcy. Excuse me. And I'm going to talk about that in a second as well, because there are some companies that have had some issues involving substance abuse and employees who have done something well under the influence of drugs that have cost that company a lot of money. And for a small business, a legal judgment in the millions of dollars means the end of that company in many cases. And I'll share an example of that. Well, I'll share it with you coming up here in this section. So marijuana may be legal in some states. We know that, 39 states altogether. But the things that individuals do while under the influence of marijuana doesn't necessarily mean they're legal also. There are 2 doctrines of law that come into play, not always tied to drug abuse, okay, but can be, and it's negligent hiring and respondeat superior. Those are 2 doctrines of law that can be used by attorneys to hold your company responsible for the bad actions of your employees. Somebody who causes an accident, harms another person, property damage, etc., maybe even a fatality, heaven forbid. But you as the employer can be, and likely in certain cases will be, held responsible if you did not make a good faith effort to identify an unsafe employee before they got behind the wheel of your delivery van or operating a forklift, for example. And here's just one example. There are many, but this is one example of a case in Kentucky. Algier versus MB Transportation. Look at that second bullet. A jury found the employer liable under the doctrine of respondeat superior. That's when somebody's functioning within the scope of employment and does something to harm another person or to cause property damage. And in this case, they were also found guilty of negligence in hiring and training. They were ordered to pay almost $5 million in compensatory and punitive damages because they hired an individual who, unbeknownst to the company, because they didn't do any pre-employment due diligence, Orange Tree could have prevented this from happening with their background screening and drug and alcohol testing program. But they hired somebody who was a current alcoholic. Now we can't, under the ADA, we can't discriminate in any way against alcoholics, current alcoholics, and I'm not suggesting that. But this individual was living, excuse me, they were living in a rehabilitation center at the time that they were hired, which should have been a big clue to the company, but they didn't do their due diligence. They caused an accident, they injured a customer, and they were held liable for that. They actually didn't conduct the post-accident drug and alcohol test for 2.5 hours. And so by that time, this individual tested negative for alcohol, but she was under the influence of alcohol at the time of the accident, and the jury found in favor of the plaintiff in this case. And there are other examples of that, but legal marijuana is not going to be a sufficient defense for an employer who could have and should have known that an employee was a safety risk, but didn't do anything to find that out before the accident occurred, or to deter drug and alcohol use by conducting, say, random testing or other forms of testing to deter drug use. Post-accident testing doesn't deter accidents. Pre-employment testing does, random testing does. Post-accident testing is a great way to do drug tests, but it doesn't deter drug use. It's a post-accident test. And so the end result here is that testing for marijuana may be the difference between a viable legal defense in a situation like we saw in that previous case, and possibly, depending on the circumstances, legal bankruptcy. So let's answer this question, because this is a question I get asked a lot. What can employers do when someone tests positive? So let's look at that for a second. I only have a couple of slides on this because it's a pretty quick answer. In most states, even where marijuana has been legalized, you can still suspend somebody who tests positive for marijuana, possibly terminate that individual's employment, offer a second chance agreement, require treatment or counseling, conduct return to duty tests and random follow-up tests. Now, under the DOT regulations, you have to do those if you don't terminate the employment. But even in states where marijuana has been legalized, under certain circumstances, and in some states without any conditions, employers can still do all of those things, including suspending and terminating somebody's employment with the company. It depends on the state law, the federal regulations that may come into play, but you still have rights when it comes to what you do with a positive drug test for marijuana. If you comply with those laws, if you follow the federal regulations, including the ADA guidelines, then you have recourse. You have things that you can do as an employer. But all of that has to be very clearly articulated in your drug testing policy. If you don't have it in writing, it doesn't exist. Even if you can say that this is our policy, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. And so your drug testing policy should be more detailed versus less detailed. I've heard people argue that you want to put as few things into your drug testing policy as possible, but I disagree with that. And I've made a career of writing drug testing policies and putting details into that policy. And one of the details that I recommend is having a dedicated section on marijuana. Not so 30 years ago when I started writing and reviewing drug testing policies, but today, for the last 20 years, absolutely, especially now where so many states have legalized marijuana, and every state that has legalized marijuana has its own unique law. No two states have the same law. Now, years ago, I was sitting in the board meeting of an organization. I was the director of the Institute for Drug-Free Workplace at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I was sitting in a board meeting next to a very senior executive from a Fortune 50 company. And everybody in the room was a senior executive from a Fortune 50 company, a Fortune 10 company, most of them. And one of those very, very senior, very experienced people leaned over to me at one point. I was very young and still learning the ways of the world in business. He leaned over to me and he said, "Bill, never forget this. The bottom line is always the bottom line." And so in the end, there may be lots of different reasons why you conduct drug testing and why you should continue testing for marijuana. But in the end, the thing that will speak loudest to a company, and it's okay, nothing wrong with this, is going to be what impact will it have on my bottom line if I don't test for marijuana or if I do test for marijuana. And keep in mind the experience of that woman that I spoke to yesterday at that conference, where 16 of 17 companies that dropped marijuana just 2 years ago had reinstated marijuana because of the negative impact that they saw in their company. If we went and talked to all 16 of those employers, I almost guarantee that every one of them would have some type of bottom line reason for reinstating marijuana in their drug test panel. So let's talk about return on investment. And let's start with this. The National Safety Council reported at the end of 2020 that 75% of people with a substance abuse disorder are employed. That's about 15% or so of the US workforce. 15% is about 1 in 6 workers, okay? 1 in 6 workers has a substance abuse disorder. Now, what does it cost? So this is a report from the University of Chicago that also came out in 2020, which found that the average annual cost of each substance abusing employee is $8,817. I love the preciseness of that, $8,817. For many years in our industry, we used a figure of $7,000 from a study that the US Navy did back in the early 1990s. This is much more current, and even though the price may actually be higher than this, let's use this figure of $8,817 for how we're going to measure the return on investment of drug testing. And when they looked at, the cost factors to come to the conclusion of 8817, it included turnover and included lost productivity due to things like absenteeism and tardiness, as well as poor performance and things related to accidents, workers' comp claims, medical expenses, etc. So the University of Chicago came to the conclusion the average cost of each substance abuser is $8,817. So let's do a little bit of math. Let's say you have 100 employees, just to keep it simple, and 15% are substance abusers. That means that you have 15 current substance abusers on your payroll, and each one of them is costing $8,817 more than their coworker. So the cost of substance abuse at your company is about $132,000, more or less. Excuse me, came home with a little bit of a cough. Now, let's look at the cost of your drug testing program. I just picked 200 drug tests a year for this company. They're doing a lot of turnover, so they're doing a lot of pre-employment tests, maybe random tests as well, and they're paying $40 a drug test. I don't know if that's what you pay. Maybe you pay less, maybe you pay more. Drug tests, the price of drug tests is based on a lot of different factors. Excuse me. And let's just do the math. $40 times 200 drug tests a year is $8,000. You're spending $8,000 on drug testing, and you're comparing that. Excuse me, I apologize. You're comparing that to the cost of substance abuse. You spend $8,000 to potentially save as much as $132,000. Now, let's take it a step further. And I just put a cough drop in, so I think that's going to help. If a company spends $40 on a pre-employment test, and it includes marijuana, and they avoid hiring just one marijuana user, excuse me, it will reduce the cost of doing business by $8,817. But if you fail to screen out that marijuana user, it's going to cost you $8,817, and it could be more. Because according to the National Safety Council, an accident that results in a medically consulted injury could cost, on average, $39,000. And an injury that involves a motor vehicle crash, on average, costs $78,466. So now suddenly, you're looking at more than $8,817 to cover the cost of hiring that one marijuana user that you didn't screen out because you chose to drop marijuana from your drug testing panel. Now let's add one other factor. In most states, employers can move to deny workers' compensation benefits to an individual who tests positive because the state regulations allow employers to deny that claim if they have a positive drug test result. In many states, even though legally and scientifically perhaps, a drug test doesn't prove impairment, in many states, those workers' comp regulations consider a positive drug test result to be proof of impairment. And they allow the employer at that point to move to deny that benefit or payment of those benefits. So if you're testing for marijuana, being the #1 illicit drug of abuse, the #1 drug that people test positive for, if you continue to test for marijuana, you continue to be in a position under certain circumstances to deny workers' comp benefits to somebody who tests positive. If you fail to test for marijuana, you're essentially saying, I'm going to incur those costs. I'm going to pay the $39,000 for a medically consulted injury, or I'm going to pay the $78,000 for a vehicle crash injury. And did you know that the average cost of a workplace fatality is $1.1 million? Heaven forbid something like that happens, but that's another cost that you could incur. And I'm not suggesting that these costs go away entirely if you continue testing for marijuana, but it puts you, the employer, in a position to be able to say, we did our part. We conduct drug testing, we conduct pre-employment testing that includes marijuana, and we made a good faith effort to screen out individuals who were more likely to cause an accident, cause an injury, property damage, etc., and possibly file a workers' compensation claim. So all of those things come into consideration when you as an employer decide we're going to drop marijuana from our drug test panel. It's a very important decision. And I do predict that in time, the majority, perhaps the vast majority of companies that decide today that they're going to drop marijuana from the drug test panel will reinstate testing for marijuana within 2 to 3 years, because the impact of dropping it is just so clear and obvious as they look at productivity, accident rates, workers' comp claims, etc. Now, another anecdote. At the conference I spoke at yesterday, I had a woman come to me at the end of the conference, works for one of the major airlines. You know, there's a lot of them, so can't guess which one it was. Not the one I flew yesterday. But very nice lady, very knowledgeable. She said that she had come to the conclusion that she should go back to her company, to her bosses, and essentially recommend that they discontinue testing for marijuana. Now, under the DOT regulations, they would still have to test in those circumstances with marijuana. But outside of that, after the presentation I gave, which included a lot of the stats that we've talked about here today, she said, I now have the information, the statistics, and the ammunition I need to go back to my company and say, it would not be a good decision on the part of the company to drop marijuana. Again, I'm in favor of drug testing. I've been in the drug testing industry for 32 years, so I clearly have, you know, a horse in this race, if you will. Not particularly with your company, but generally speaking. I was speaking at a conference not too long ago at a human resource conference on the West Coast. I won't name which state, but I talked about the marijuana issue. Of course, marijuana is legal in all of those Pacific Coast states. And I talked about the importance of drug testing. And, you know, Jeff was very kind in his remarks about my speaking and my speaking abilities, et cetera, et cetera. But I got some negative reviews at that conference. And the negative reviews centered on one thing. He seemed to be against marijuana and in favor of drug testing. And I thought, well, I know they meant that as a negative review and they gave me low marks, but I consider that a positive. I just think that we live at a time when culturally there are debates going on subjects like marijuana and its legalization that will have long-term impact on the quality of life in our country and in the workplace. In particular, its impact on young people. There's still evolving scientific data coming out that points to the negative impact of marijuana use on children who are still developing in many ways. And so there's lots of reasons to think about why marijuana shouldn't be legal. Let me point out one other thing before I come to my conclusion. I'm almost there. In the 70s, after the Vietnam War, there was a movement toward legalizing all drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, etc. A lot of people came back from Vietnam under the influence or addicted to these drugs, and for better or worse, and there were lots of reasons for that. And I'm not making a statement on the Vietnam War. My father fought in the Vietnam War. My uncles fought in the Vietnam War. I missed it because of my age and whatnot. So not a commentary on that, just the fact that people came back from the war addicted to lots of different drugs. So there was this movement. And the movement wasn't just to legalize marijuana, it was to legalize all drugs. There just wasn't a national appetite for that. And so the argument sort of narrowed to marijuana. But there was no argument, there was no appetite for that either at the time and throughout the 80s. And so within the legalization movement, the argument narrowed even further to medical marijuana, the compassionate argument that people suffering from certain illnesses and diseases should have access to marijuana because of its medical benefit components. And then there was acceptance. Started out slow, but then it spread. And now today, across the country, the majority of people believe that medical marijuana should be legal. But that was never the objective. The objective was always to legalize all drugs. And so medical marijuana led to recreational marijuana. And now we're starting to see states decriminalize and legalize other drugs. Oregon being the first state to legalize all illicit drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc., in small personal use quantities. California considering similar legislation at this time. Other states and municipalities have decriminalized or legalized magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and other sort of hallucinogenic drugs. It's a process, and it's leading to the legalization and the decriminalization of drugs besides marijuana. My only point in mentioning all of that in conclusion is that employers still have the right to prevent employees from being at work under the influence of these substances, whether it's marijuana or psilocybin or any other drugs for that matter. It's very difficult to prove impairment from a drug test. From a legal scientific standpoint, it doesn't prove impairment, but other behaviors that come from substance abuse can be used to in conjunction with a positive drug test result to say this individual was impaired. As an employer, we have the right, as long as we've documented these things and we're using them in combination and not relying solely on a marijuana positive result in, say, Illinois, which would require some evidence of impairment before you can take adverse employment action. As long as I've documented these things and I'm using them in conjunction with the positive drug test result, I have a legal ground to stand on. I can take adverse employment action possibly if I can show that there was a pattern of behavior that points to impairment. When this type of behavior is thoroughly documented, the positive marijuana drug test result becomes just one of several items that can be used to take that action. In conclusion, there are many reasons I think why a company should continue testing for marijuana. Marijuana use is on the rise, more employees are testing positive, there are negative consequences like traffic-related or marijuana-related traffic fatalities. But if to you, owning a business that is thriving, that is productive, and that is staying out of court is important to you, then I think you've got to continue testing for marijuana. How much of a difference does it make to a company like Orange Tree? You know, a big company like that? Of course, they're in the interest of giving you the best advice and counsel possible. Does it change the price of your drug test to drop marijuana? Probably not. It's negligible, if at all. In fact, I know of companies in our industry that increase the price to drop marijuana from a drug test panel. The point here is, in the end, you've got to do what's right for your company and for your employees, the majority of whom do not use drugs or abuse alcohol. And they're not marijuana smokers, even though it's been legalized in your state. And so with that, let me turn it back to Jeff and Lori for any questions that you may have submitted.
You know, Bill, thank you very much for laying out some context for our employers. I know many are dealing with this in their boardrooms today, their conference rooms, and they're just trying to do the right thing for the business, and they're trying to do the right thing for the people. I'm reminded of John Maxwell, I think one of the leading experts on management today, and he talks about culture and the fact that culture, in his opinion, eats strategy and vision for lunch. And so this is one of those cultural issues that all of our employers have to face head on, and it's one that's very active and I'm sure consumes a lot of their time. So thank you very much for laying out some of the details, and certainly everyone should know that Bill and his organization help companies like this every day work through their business policy and do the right thing for all of the stakeholders that are involved in the process. In fact, speaking of policy, Bill, we had a question from one of today's listeners, and they wondered if you does Current Consulting Group have handbook template language about a marijuana policy? Is that something that you guys provide, or?
Yeah, absolutely. But let me add this caveat.
Okay.
You know, the marijuana issue, like all sorts of other drug testing related issues, is governed by state law. And so Illinois treats legal marijuana in the workplace and in relation to the workplace different than Nevada does, different than Colorado, certainly different than New York and New Jersey, which are two of the most restrictive states in the country. In Nevada, for example, Jeff, as you probably know, if an applicant tests positive for marijuana, you're legally allowed to test for marijuana. You just can't deny employment based on that positive drug test result, solely because of that result, or the fact that in Illinois, for example, based on the fact that somebody's a quote unquote legal or medical marijuana user, is a registered medical marijuana user. My point in all of that is that you kind of have to address that on a state by state basis, but only in the states that apply to you. And so if you're creating a policy on marijuana, definitely you want that in your written drug testing policy, but you don't want to base it on the most restrictive law that you have a business operations, in Illinois. You don't want to base it on the Illinois marijuana law. You want to base it on what's right for your company, and then add addendums if necessary in the states where it's more restrictive. But I wouldn't apply the most restrictive standard, say Nevada's pre-employment testing law, to the rest of my company, because I don't want to be that handicapped when dealing with this on a nationwide basis.
Very good. So kind of maybe almost an offshoot of the remarks relative to states and considering the different states that you're located in. Just looking at the map that you shared and have updated for us again, thank you for doing that. I see some MSAs. So like in Chicago, where there's no doubt people from Wisconsin could go to Chicago, vice versa. I suppose the real impact is thinking about where in Illinois, you have recreational marijuana approved. Wisconsin doesn't have either types, medicinal or recreational approved yet. There's going to be people presumably leaving Chicagoland to work in Milwaukee. And there's other MSAs like that. I think St. Louis, just looking at the map, Philadelphia probably is another classic one. Kind of the East Coast, there could be some others. How do you recommend employers work with that?
Well, very generally, it's based on where the individual works. And so let's say it's an Illinois-based company, but they have offices or operations in Wisconsin. That doesn't mean that individual on a visit to the corporate headquarters in Chicago can legally buy marijuana, which of course they can in Illinois, but then bring it back to Wisconsin and use it legally there where it's not legal. And so again, that comes back to the point I was making earlier, which is you don't want to base your drug testing policy on the most restrictive standard. You want to base it on what's right for your company and then add addendums as needed. But that's a really great question that's coming up more and more because a lot of states have legalized marijuana. So this just happened with one of our clients where they had an individual go to Colorado on business, purchase marijuana, use it, came back and, as fate would have it, I guess was selected for a random drug test and they still had marijuana in their system. So they tested positive. Well, this individual works out of that headquarter state, not Colorado. They were just in Colorado on a business trip. So, the consequences would apply, unfortunately, for that individual because it's where they normally work. In other words, if I'm on a sales trip and I'm going through 6 or 7 different states, the law that applies to me doesn't change. It's still the headquarter state where I normally work, which in this case would have been Wisconsin and not Colorado where I was on a one-day business trip.
Yeah. Okay. Looks like we may have all of today's questions answered, Bill. Okay. If anyone does have any follow-up questions or you share this information with colleagues and something comes up and you'd like to learn a little bit more about what it is you're trying to solve for, reach out to me Contact information is at the end of the deck. Certainly can reach out to your Orange Tree client care specialist if you're working with Orange Tree as a client today, and we'll get you the information either directly or we'll work with our fine team and partner over at Parent Consulting Group and make sure we get you the answer that you're looking for. And perhaps if you're looking for a little bit more help, direct engagement with Bill and his team to develop the policy that you're trying to accomplish could do maybe do you some good. And as you wrestle with this topic, as I mentioned, Bill shared 3 compelling reasons and a lot of data to support those. And it really is one of the 3 top questions that we get at Orange Tree, because it's on the minds of you, and we try to do our best to guide you toward the best answer for you. So thank you for attending today's webinar. Look for a follow-up email, and if you have any questions, be sure to let us know. Bill, thank you very much as always for your expertise.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.